This CoinWeek Podcast is brought to you by PCGS. The popular PCGS Coin Price Magazine Rare Coin Market Report is back and free to all PCGS Collectors Club members and authorized dealers. This bi-monthly companion magazine to the PCGS online prize guide and mobile app will feature 140 pages of coin pricing information as well as articles written by respected numismatists. On this episode of the CoinWeek Podcast, we talk to recently retired U.S. Mint sculptor engraver Don Everhart. We talk about his career at the Mint, what he learned along the way, and whether the United States Mint should go the way of other foreign mints, and ask Congress to give the Mint the authority to design its own numismatic programs. You'll hear what Don has to say next on the CoinWeek Podcast. Hi, Don. Happy retirement. And thank you for joining me on the CoinWeek Podcast.
Thank you, Charles.
So are you happy to be a private citizen again and no longer duty-bound or beholden to the giant bureaucracy of the U.S. Mint coin-making factory?
Well, I'm glad that I don't have to commute anymore, and I'm glad I don't have to get up at 4:30 anymore. But I do miss some of the people that I worked with, and, it was pros and cons in the decision-making process, but I figured it was time.
Obviously, during your tenure at the United States Mint, it produced more coin designs than it had at any previous point in American history. But given that operational tempo, what was your day-to-day work like as a sculptor engraver?
Well, personally, I normally get in around 6 o'clock, and usually that's before anyone else does, so I try to take care of things that I can do, without being interrupted. But normally, if we have design work to do, I work on design work, and, if I have sculpture to do, I work that in. I generally like to do the creative work in the morning because that's when I'm sharpest, and then save, some of the less creative stuff, for the afternoon. Like sculpting to me is pretty much automatic, so I don't have to think a whole lot about that, but designing is a different animal, and it takes a lot of concentration and more creativity, I think. So, that interspersed with meetings all day long was what my schedule was like.
Do you still prefer to sculpt by hand on plaster?
Yeah, I do, Charles. That's how I learned the art from way back in the Franklin Mint days, and I recently acquired enough skills to work with ZBrush to do edits on my sculpt when they were needed, but I won't ever start a sculpt in a digital format because it's at my age it's like, what's the point of changing now when I've been doing this for 40 plus years, the traditional method, and it's been working for me.
In a nutshell, being familiar with both processes and knowing artists who work in both media, what are the pros and cons to each design method?
Yeah, that's a good question. Generally, I feel that in my case, and in a lot of other cases that I've seen, not all of them, of course, but I feel that there's more of a human emotional touch to the artwork that's done by hand. I like being able to, hold the clay, hold the tools, that kind of thing. It's just kind of, in my experience, it's been kind of removed to actually sculpt on a computer. It's not familiar with me, but I generally like to do the sculpture in the traditional method where I use, clay and then I cast it into a plaster. And that's what I'm most comfortable with, and that's what I've gotten the best results with. However, I will say that for doing digital edits, it's a lot easier, a lot quicker. If I was to change something in plaster, I may have to go back and recast it into another negative and then into another positive to get the results I want. But in the digital format, I can just put it up on the screen and make, the tweaks that I need to do, and they're done in 10 minutes. So, I see that there are advantages and disadvantages to both approaches, and some people, that are more versed in the digital realm are very good at what they do, and I would not suggest that they work traditionally at all, but for me, given my experience, it's really been a lot more productive for me to work in the traditional method and then do the limited edits that I can do digitally. And that seems to work for me.
I was at the Mint last year, and I was able to visit the engraving department, where I looked at the 1964 Morgan dollar hubs that were recently revealed as being held in the Mint vault. And while I was there, I had a chance to talk to Joe Minna at his desk. And he was talking to me about the benefits of working digitally, and he walked me through the process of editing a design on the computer. He was adding and taking away detail and texture using these preset texture brushes, which he applied like one would, use a paintbrush tool on Photoshop. Which speaks of what you're saying about how, the way software makes it easy to make these edits. But one of the things that we were talking about in design of the coin or metal is something that I like to call hide and seek. This is, when an artist implies a detail on the relief that isn't really fully rendered. Because of space, scale, or height requirements, So these details get alluded to. And you see this a lot in the designs of Laura Garden Fraser or Adolph Weinman or Augustus St. Gaudens. But you don't really see it much these days. Joe Minna told me that part of the reason for this is that designs now have to be very precise in order to be properly cameo frosted when proofs are struck. Are collectors' desire for proof versions with frosted devices limiting to what the artist can do with the design?
Well, I think that it really depends on experience and the level of talent that the user of the digital techniques has. I mean, I've seen some just unbelievable sculpts that were done digitally that just really were just exceptionally done. Again, myself, I don't have the experience to do that, but I think Joe is probably the most well-versed of the staff as far as working digitally. He works totally digitally. He does not work in clay and plaster. But I think it really comes down to the talent of the individual sculptor that's doing it and their experience level.
What was it like working at the Mint engraving department when the production methods shifted from hand tools and plaster design to computer-based design?
Well, in our department, which I can really only speak to because that's where I have the most experience, I mean, there was some resistance because, when I got there, nobody was working digitally. And when I left, I was pretty much the only one that was not until I did finally learn how to do the edits, in a very limited sense. But I think, gradually people saw that there are great advantages to the digital aspect. Again, when I said about doing edits on plasters and things, I mean, I generally myself, I kind of resisted it in the beginning, but as I moved along in the department and in my experience there, I took up the digital to a limited extent, and I saw that there were definitely advantages, not only in time amount to do edits and things, but it just really streamlined the operation a lot, and I don't think that there's any more resistance to it. It's pretty much an accepted thing to do right now as far as sculpting. And you know what? It's just another tool in the toolbox. It's just another way of getting from point A to point B. And, I think the more tools you have, the better the chances are that you're going to be successful in, finishing off a piece that, might need just a little extra in the way of edits or something like that. It's just, like I say, it's another tool that we have. The quality of the work is what matters the most. And if you can get that traditionally or digitally, it doesn't matter to me. It's just, the final product is what's most important.
Before you worked at the United States Mint, you worked at a private mint, the Franklin Mint. What would you say the difference in the approach that you were able to take working at a private mint, where I assume that the requirements on an artist are a little looser, as opposed to the U.S. Mint, where designs must be first described by Congress and sometimes in great detail about what the design has to look like, and then the potential designs are vetted and manipulated before being settled on by a committee and the Treasury Secretary.
Yeah, there is that. I mean, you learn to adapt to that after a while. But when I worked at the Franklin Mint, basically, I didn't really do a lot of design work. Mostly they would hand me a design and say, "Here, Don, sculpt it." Because we had a design department of which, you know, I was not really in that department. I was in the sculpture department. So gradually I started doing more designs there. But really the bulk of the coin design that I've done really only happened when I started at the United States Mint, where I've done literally thousands of designs, and compared to the amount of sculpts I've done, you know, it's a small percentage of sculpts to designs, and I think that's the main difference. I mean, it was a different time back then, so like everything was different. But generally, as far as my approach to sculpting, you know, I was really learning in that stage. And when I was at the Franklin Mint, that's the first sculpture I ever did. I graduated with a painting degree, and I kicked around for about a year or so after I graduated, and then wound up at the Franklin Mint. And actually, I started as like a layout design on, you know, for mechanicals and, you know, the advertising that they did. And it wasn't until I was there for a year that I decided that, well, you know, this really isn't working for me. I need to do something more artistically. So I thought, you know, while I'm here and I have a foot in the door, why don't I try out? Because I've been watching the sculptors, you know, I'd take a break or lunchtime, I'd go see what they were working on. And I was really intrigued by, you know, this new medium that I had never had any experience with, and never in my wildest dreams would I ever have thought that my career would take the turn that it did, but it did as a result of working at the Franklin Mint. I started out they gave me a couple tryout jobs, and then they hired me on the third one. So I went from being a pay stuff artist doing mechanicals into being one of the sculptors literally in a day. And that's what I call my master's degree. That's where I really learned how to do this stuff. I was doing between 50 and 60 sculpts a year at the Franklin Mint. And again, that's where I really learned how to do it. When I look back at some of the early sculpts I did, I thought, wow, how did this ever get approved? You know, because I've really developed my own skills over the years, and anyone that's been in the business for as long as I have certainly should have developed their skills over the years. But, you know, that's the main thing I took from the Franklin Mint. There was a lot of experience that I gained there, and then after I left the Mint, I worked for 24 years as a freelance artist, and I did all kinds of work from coins to toys to giftware to installations to life-size figures in bronze, and really had a more rounded experience as opposed to just doing coins and metals. And then when I got to the United States Mint, you know, I did really just coins and metals, and I think I really honed my design skills there as opposed to, you know, just being a sculptor. I became more of a designer / sculptor. And, you know, I take a lot of pride in the designs that I've done at the United States Mint. Like I say, I think I really learned a lot by doing. I mean, when I've done over 1,000 designs at the Mint, and I haven't kept track of them, but I'm sure it's well over 1,000, you've got to learn something. And, you know, I believe that I really, you know, I really developed my skills at the United States Mint for designing and sculpting. I'm a better sculptor now than I was 20, 30 years ago, and I should be.
Please humor me with this question. So if you can remember back to your earliest executed sculpts, what would you say that you learned over your career that would help you, you know, in looking back, improve that design?
Well, I learned a lot more about the figure and anatomy. When I went to school, they really didn't teach much of that. You know, we had some figure drawing, but mostly you were on your own if you wanted to learn the figure. And you know, through many designs, you know, I had to like improve that skill. Another thing that I felt that I learned a lot was I applied what I learned when I was in college. Let me backtrack a little bit. I started out in college as an advertising major, and I went for 2 years in advertising. When I realized that I really didn't like it, I wanted to do fine art. So then I changed my major to painting. But even though I changed my major, I learned a lot from those advertising 2 years. I learned a lot about type and typography, and I tried to apply that when I was doing my designs at the U.S. Mint, and not just use, you know, some uniform line of of a typeface and not do anything to it. I tried to change, different sizes of different letters and, look back at some of the old masters, metals and see how they handled type and try to, really jazz it up a little bit so that it just wasn't boring looking. So yeah, that's a couple of changes that I feel I developed in my time there.
Who were your favorite artists that you worked with at the Mint or before? Who really stood out to you as phenomenal?
There were a number that I worked with when I worked at the Franklin Mint. I came in at the tail end of Gilroy Roberts' career, and I used to go into his office and watch him. He was sculpting birds at the time, and he was always very helpful and friendly and gave me a lot of advice. I also have always been a fan of Philip Nathan. He's a British sculptor, and I always was just idolized his work. Jim Farrell was very good at the Franklin Mint. As I got further on at the United States Mint, I worked with John Mercanti, who was just a wonderful sculptor, great designer, and Phoebe Temple, who I consider one of the greats that will go down in history. Just her work is just superb. So, and I try to take a little bit from each person, learn a little bit from each person and apply it to my own work. And I think that's how you can become, more versatile and well-rounded in your career.
When I see him, I always tell John Mercanti that his architectural designs are very wonderful. And I agree with you about Phoebe Temple. I think she is one of the most underrated artists to ever work at the United States Mint. Her sculpt this year for the high relief gold coin and silver medal is among the finest portraits ever issued by the Mint.
Yeah, I don't know that she's underrated. I think more and more people are finding out about her. And as she, extends her career at the United States Mint, that's only going to, develop even more.
What were some of your favorite designs that you authored?
Well, I always liked my Nevada State Quarter with the horses on it. It was the first design I had selected, and it's still one of my favorites. I like the baseball coin. But generally, I'm a medalist at heart, so I think some of my favorite designs were congressional gold medals that I did. For example, the Tzu Chi medal, both sides are my designs, and the Constantino Brumidi medal, both sides are my designs. I'm very proud of those. Also very proud of the March of Dimes reverse that I did a couple years ago. For a couple of reasons, it incorporates a lot of my family into it. My daughter had a baby on June 8th in 2012, and the day he was born, his father came in and held him in his hand. And my daughter is a photographer. She's very well known, and she's really good at wedding and child photography. She took a picture of him. So I had this picture in the back of my mind. I was working on the March of Dimes designs, and I was just not coming up with anything. And for some reason, this photograph that she had done of her husband holding Jack, the baby, in his hand, came to my mind, and I called her and said, "Do you mind if I use this for a design?" She's like, "No, go right ahead, please." So I did, and I did some modifications to it, but I adapted it to the coin parameters, and it got chosen, and it's got quite a backstory to it, and I know that it was very popular, and it actually won Coin of the Year last year for most inspirational. So yeah, that was one of my favorites. Yeah, and I didn't make a lot of that when the coin came out, because really it wasn't about my family. It was about the March of Dimes. But now that it's been said and done, I think we can talk about that. I'm also very proud of the 2016 National Parks Gold. Again, they were both sides of mine. For the I did Yosemite Park with John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt. Looking to the left, and then the reverse had the National Parks logo superimposed upon a landscape. Both those designs worked very well for me because they kind of incorporated the park into the subject matter, not only the logo, which, like I say, is superimposed over a background that could have been taken, and incorporated into the logo, but not only that, but on the obverse, both of the portraits kind of fade into the landscape, implying that they were, part of the park from the beginning. So I think that one really worked on a number of levels.
So when you first came on board at the United States Mint and it, got your first design struck, did it feel different to you, having your art on an official coin in the United States? I mean, does it feel different to have your art reproduced on such a massive scale? Or even maybe when you receive a coin and change that you created, did that impact you differently than, say, some of the other projects that you saw fully realized as objects?
It did in the beginning. When I did the Nevada State Quarter, one day I was out at lunch and I got the quarter and change. This is when I first got to the Mint. And I said to the vendor, I designed and sculpted this. And he just looked at me like, yeah, sure. I'm sure you did. So I haven't ever done that again.
I get that. I get that anecdote from every designer I have ever talked to. So that must be a universal experience for coin designers. I don't know if you're aware of this, and I don't know if I had your job, whether I would care too much to go into the coin media and the internet and read what people had to say about my work, especially people in the hobbyist community. But to give you a little bit of perspective on things, the American Numismatic Association members, at the time of the release of the St. Gaudens $20 gold coin, or the Peace Dollar, or the reverse of Felix Schlag's Jefferson nickel, wrote many letters decrying these designs and talking about how poor they were and how, if only the opinions of trained numismatists are taken into account, that the designs could be much, much better. But then, for these designs, as time went on, they became familiar and people's opinions about them changed. So given that things haven't changed all that much in the past 100 years when it comes to coin critics in the hobby community, do you pay attention to what people have to say about your designs, or do you stay away from it?
Well, I personally I can't say I avoided it consciously. I just really never was that interested. I knew that a lot of the comments are always negative. But I think, when you're in the position that I was, you just learn to take that with a grain of salt because you're not going to please everybody. It's impossible. So, I just tried to do what I felt was the best work and please myself and not worry about the comments because, in the internet these days, you can be anonymous and you can really rip somebody and there's no consequences to the person that's doing it. So, it's kind of easy to do. Whereas a face-to-face meeting, maybe you wouldn't get the same comments. But basically, I was never interested in some of the petty comments that were made on blogs and things like that. I just really never followed that.
Well, take that, collectors. No, but, you make a great point, and I agree with you. But I want our audience to realize and keep in mind that every coin design that comes out, when it's new, it will seem unfamiliar and perhaps awkward. But that with time, a truly good design will stand out and endure. But it's good to know that coin designers at the Mint aren't staring at computer screens all day, waiting for Modern Coin Collector 629 on the forums to post a comment about how much he thinks the stars on Liberty's head are too big.
Right, and to really, develop the idea a little bit further, I think the vast majority of comments that I did read when I was, for some reason looking for them were positive. But, you get that occasional one which, would really rip your design or you or whatever. But, I think after a while as far as being a United States Mint engraver, you just kind of take it with a grain of salt.
You know what it is, though? I think it's that it's a public process. You have the CCAC and the CFA, and so what typically happens is that we get to see all the candidate design sketches before the committees make their selections. And oftentimes there's some very elaborate, very interesting designs that don't get selected, and I think this frustrates people. But something people need to keep in mind is that an elaborate pencil rendering on a large canvas does not always translate well onto a coin. So can you explain why that is?
I think there's a number of reasons for that. Is that, a lot of artists, they try to put too much in a coin. When you look at the palette, it's very small. So I think that when you're designing, you have to keep in mind that you want something that's iconic. and simple and explains your point very clearly, so that you recognize it immediately. You don't have to search around, look for clues here hidden in the foliage or whatever. It's an iconic, simple image, and I think a lot of artists don't grasp that immediately. I mean, take, for example, our AIP. They are really a bunch of great artists and designers, but mostly they're illustrators, and I don't know that any of them that do sculpture, but they do really great designs. But sometimes, they do illustrations, and they're not really suited for, coin design. And, people on my staff and myself included have done that. So it's not just something that, AIP artists do, because I have nothing but high regard for those artists. I know them personally. I know their work without even seeing their initials on it. And I have great respect for them and all the other artists I work with. But it's just sometimes it's just easy to fall into the trap of putting a lot more information in than what you need. And, I've been guilty of that myself. But if you try to keep the point in your mind that it's just a small canvas, even the largest coins we do, and even a 3-inch metal, it's a small canvas. And you have to design accordingly, I think.
What, in your mind, are the ideal characteristics of good coin design?
Well, again, I would go back to simplicity. I think that, the font that you use, the lettering you use should complement the subject matter. If it's a portrait, it has to look like that person. And if it's another idea that you're trying to convey, it needs to be concise. It needs to be distilled down to the absolute essence of the subject matter. So that when you look at it, you immediately know what the artist was trying to convey. You don't have to go into a guessing game and try and think, how does the reverse relate to the obverse? They should complement each other. And, that's about all I can think of for that.
When you look out and see the way that foreign mints are now creating coins with all sorts of different types of designs, and some licensed designs, others are based on historical events or themes that reach out into the general public in ways that are sort of like what you did at the Franklin Mint in the 1970s. This, of course, is much different than the way the U.S. Mint is able to operate, because our coinage is determined by Congress. So it's much more limited in scope, and oftentimes it's based on themes that are not market tested, but instead based on one or two legislators' parochial interests. Do you feel that the United States Mint, in order to give collectors coin programs that they might really want, should work with the Treasury and Congress to change the law regarding how U.S. Mint numismatic coins are made?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Congress does dictate to us, which coins and metals we would produce. And in a lot of instances lately, they're telling us what they want on them and how they want it done. But I think that, a lot of private mints and other foreign mints don't have to deal with those kind of restrictions, and they're far more liberated to do, subject matter and different techniques than we are. I do think that we are a bit conservative, and that we could, experiment a little bit more with, different subject matter and different types of striking coins, like the curved coin. The baseball coin was very popular, and I think the Apollo 11 will be also. But, we didn't do that first. Other mints did that before we did. So, I think we need to probably be a little bit more creative in, not just the techniques we use, but the ideas and the subject matter. But again, a lot of that depends on what Congress tells us to do. And a lot of people don't understand that the Mint just doesn't sit there and say, okay, we're going to do a commemorative on breast cancer or whatever. It's always dictated by Congress. So we have to work within those parameters. And sometimes they can be quite restrictive. Although, a creative artist can open up those ideas and find new ways to convey their ideas. So, a lot of it comes down to the individual artist too, and I think that that's important.
The one thing that strikes me is cognitive dissonance when it comes to the very idea that Congress mandates these programs is when the CFA and the CCAC gets together and they discuss which of the designs would sell best with collectors, even though, you look at some of these programs and there's no way that there will ever be enough interest amongst collectors or promoters in the secondary market for these programs to ever sell out. Do poorly conceived programs weigh on a mint artist's mind when it comes time to design these coins?
Well, as artists, as one of the engravers, I mean, we personally, I may not totally relate to some of the subject matter that's not only suggested but asked for by Congress. I may not relate to that personally, but I have to come up with something nevertheless. And that's something I think every artist faces when they get a commission is how do I create something that's interesting to the subject matter, and I'm not that maybe interested in it. So it's something that you have to overcome. And I think for me, it's a trial and error thing. When I come up with a design, hardly ever do I come up with one immediately. It's usually I might have 20 iterations as I refine my ideas and my drawing and everything. It starts out very vague and rough, and then I gradually hone in on it till I have what I hope is a nice sharp point at the end. And it's that iconic, simple image that I'm trying to convey. But yeah, it's sometimes difficult to relate to certain subject matter. I mean, we all have our preferences, and personally, I can't put dinosaurs on every coin, so I have to learn how to do things that maybe aren't my strength, my strong suit. But I have to do it nevertheless because that's my job.
So at this point, are there any unpublished Don Everhart coin designs that are slated to come out in the next year or so?
Well, I don't know. When I left, I had done designs for the America the Beautiful for 2019. And I know that I had some strong designs in there, but I don't know if they'll be picked or not. So that's a possibility. I know that I sculpted the World War I commemorative, and I sculpted also the one of the World War I medals that they'll be coming out. That's all that I can think of right now. Also, I did some designs for the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, Congressional Gold Medal. And I don't know if any of my designs will be picked or not. So there's a bunch of them that are still in the running, but whether they're chosen at this point, I don't know until probably another month or so.
Did you collect examples of your own work over the years?
Well, I try to get coins that I've designed and sculpted. But if it comes down to something like a gold or a platinum, and I've got to pay $1,000 for it, I'm probably going to pass on that. But I try to get the ATBs and the medals that I've designed, the congressional golds. If I like what I've done, I'll buy that, because we aren't given any samples as mint employees. We have to buy them also. So I only have a very small fraction of the work that I've produced during the years that I actually have samples of, because when I'm freelancing, you don't always get the samples, even though you may be promised them. And like I said, some of the pieces that I've done for the U.S. Mint, like a platinum, I'm not going to shell out $1,000, $1,500 for a coin when, I could be spending it on bikes or something like that.
So I'd like to put you on the spot for my last question, and I'm assuming that you might know the answer to the question, but maybe not, and it's okay if you know or don't know, or you don't want to tell me. So the question is, who sculpted the spaghetti hair versions of the Kennedy half dollar and Washington quarter?
Yeah, I do, but they were instructed. The artist was instructed to do that from a higher up in the organization.
So we won't find out from you today, huh?
No, because I worked with this individual, and I'm not going to, try to place blame, because they were only doing what they were instructed to do.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you fielding the question anyway. It's very important. If you don't ask, you won't find out. Well, Don, thank you for joining me, and congratulations to you on your great career, and I hope you can get out there and enjoy yourself on that bike.
Well, Charles, I'm not retiring from sculpture or design. I'm only retiring from the mint. So I'm going to continue to do artwork as long as I'm able.
All right. Well, thank you again, and good luck.
Thank you, Charles.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends or your coin club. Remember, you can download all 70-plus episodes of the CoinWeek Podcast for free from the iTunes Store. For CoinWeek, I'm editor Charles Morgan. Until next time, happy collecting.